Hello, today we are going to look at a top essay that comes from a viewer of mine called Bo. And Bo produced this, I'm assuming it's a boy, sorry Bo if you're a girl, in his mock. And he's comparing Emigree and War Photographer. I'm going to pick on 6 key things that I'm going to teach you in this video, although I will teach you a lot more. However, you're going to learn how to structure a comparison, then the really useful skill of how to unpick a quotation in detail, the top skill that defines a grade 7 and above, which is having more than one interpretation, not all the way through your essay, but in parts of it, how to write about the poet's purpose, which again is essential to the grade 7 and above. You're also going to come across some ideas that you've never heard of before because Bo is a really deep thinker and he's got some fantastic ideas for you. And then finally, you're going to see what this skill of keeping writing looks like. Many students ask how long their essay should be, and I say the answer is 40 minutes long, and you'll see what I mean as we go. Okay, I will read it to you because Bo's handwriting is not the easiest, but that in itself is something important for you to realise. A neat handwriting isn't what you necessarily need, okay? A certain amount of messiness will help you write faster, which will help you make more points, which will give you more marks. Right, let's look at his introduction. In both War Photographer and the Emigree, ideas about conflict are explored. Rumens presents a childhood recount of conflict that can be moulded and shaped, whilst Duffy's portrayal of conflict is more permanently damaging. So, what makes this introduction work is that there's a similarity, they're both to do with conflict, but there's a powerful difference. So Rumens imagines that her childhood memories can change, she can adapt to the conflict, whereas in War Photographer, there is permanent damage, possibly to the photographer himself. The Emigree begins with an almost whimsical, fairy tale-esque declarative. There once was a country. Now, you don't need this word declarative, but it's a useful one because it tells you that they're making a statement. I teach my students not to bother with this sort of language as it normally gets in the way. But if you understand it fully, then you can use it. Both the use of ellipsis and this Brothers Grimm style of opening is cliched, which Rumens employs to subtly suggest to the reader that English is not the speaker's first language. So this is a really cool idea. What Bo's suggesting here is there once was a country is just like a fairy tale story. Natural speakers of English wouldn't begin a story this way because it seems too childish. However, a foreigner who's learned English as a second language might begin this way and not realise that it was clumsy. So that's Bo's theory, which Rumens employs to subtly suggest to the reader that the English is not the speaker's first language, that whilst their control of vocabulary and grammar are confident, seen in the poem's fluency, the speaker's true personality is not thought in English, but in the language of the country they left. So there's an interesting idea that you can steal, that this is a highly educated foreigner speaking, because that will link to the isolation of that narrator. Whilst Rumens' speaker takes pride in the foreignness of their origins, Duffy's War Photographer sees the places he works as relentless and all-encompassing. With the opening line, "In his dark room, he is finally alone," showing this. So we've got a kind of a cheat comparison here. So when I wanted to teach you about structure, you just move from one poem to the next. So he's made the point that Rumens' speaker takes pride, and then he's thinking, right, I've got to say something about the War Photographer now that's similar or different, and he's picked on something that's different. He's not taking pride in this place. It's it's instead relentless and hostile. He hasn't made this point very well, but he doesn't worry about it because it's an exam. But he's just saying that there's something different in the tone. The adverb finally presents, I'm not sure what that says, probably anywhere, presents anywhere that is not his dark room as tiring, inescapable, not home even, with the assonance of alone linking orally or hourly, so in sound, linking hourly to the assonance of home. So this paragraph here isn't scoring really highly yet, because although Beau's making really good points about each poem, he's not directly comparing them. So this is, despite the number of ticks that his teacher has given him, this is a less effective comparison because the points don't necessarily relate. But he's going to pick up his game. Both Rumin's Emigree and Duffy's War Photographer have left a war zone, so there's a direct comparison. He's back on track, but for entirely separate reasons. Can you see how he did that in his introduction? He had a difference, and he's doing that again now. From Rumin's title, we already learnt a great deal about the speakers. Firstly, they are female, with the double E ending connoting femininity in the noun's original French. We also know that they are displaced due to the war or disaster at home. Okay, so he's made a really good point that Emigree means it's a female person, but now he's got to link that to the poet's purpose somehow. Let's see how he does it. So this is in comparison to the war photographer who purposefully travels to war zones, only returning home to develop and sell their works. So we've got a comparison of why they're in the war zones, but we don't have a comparison of male v female here, which Beau could have done to get even better marks. Duffy ends the final stanza with the short declarative, "All flesh is grass." This line is taken from the New Testament and is generally taken as a view that all life is transient. In other words, we don't last long, just like grass doesn't. It gets mown down, it gets cut, like we get mown down by death. However, Duffy may be subverting this view and instead showing how the war photographer rationalizes the horror captured on his spools of suffering. So now we're into alternative interpretations, which you signal to the examiner with the word however. This paragraph is what propels the essay into the very, very top band, because there's a real interpretation around the line from the New Testament here. Let's dig a little deeper. So, captured in the spools of suffering, that, like the world, humans too are part of a grand design, greater than we can appreciate. So now we're introducing a new idea, or Beau is introducing a new idea, that this war is part of a grand design, and the photographer's presence in the war, recording it, is part of a grand design. And of course, because of the religious theme of the New Testament, this is God's design. So Beau's introducing the idea that the photographer could be a deeply Christian person who is bearing witness to this suffering because it's their Christian duty to do so. And that's a really original interpretation. So, linking to the biblical idea of creationism, perhaps Duffy is presenting the war photographer as using the epistemic distance between himself and his God to comfort him. So without getting into what epistemic means, this is the idea that Beau is giving us. Duffy deliberately makes this a Christian photographer who is looking at the distance between the experience that he's living through and his God, and trying to understand, how is this a God who will comfort me when they're exposing all these people to such damage and war? And that, of course, is a fundamental problem for a Christian. How do you cope with the tragedies of what happen in life? How do you see a benign and good God at the back of it? So this again is a really interesting interpretation. Using the word perhaps tells the examiner that you're looking at alternative points of view. So this whole section that I've just read propels the answer into the highest grades. Right. The nightmare of half-formed ghosts are part of a godly, I think that says ordering, incomprehensible to him. So this is really interesting. You know, the photographs are ordered in the darkroom, and he describes everything in an order. Well, Bo is saying that's not the photographer alone who's ordering things. He's doing that to suggest that God is ordering things. These half-formed ghosts are real, but the image of them being half-formed shows that the photographer himself can't perceive things properly, or rather, can't perceive things as fully as God can. So to God, the perspective would be whole images of real people that he could see in their entirety. And it's only humans who don't understand what they can see properly because they don't have God's omniscient view. Again, a really sophisticated interpretation. And it's the word that's going to be most useful to you there is talking about how it's incomprehensible to the photographer. So then he adds in the idea that conflict is a conscious design effort which tests the strength of his faith. So now he's suggesting that God has a purpose here to test the Christian faith of the photographer by exposing him to these horrors. And similarly, will be testing the faith of the victims, presumably, of these horrors. So you can see how he has looked at different interpretations of the poem and different viewpoints that the poet might have. Rumens describes how her speaker's memory of her childhood home is like a filled paperweight. This simile is oxymoronic, with the word paperweight containing two juxtaposing words. So he means paper is a contrast to weight, because weight is heavy and paper is incredibly light. And he's saying that's like an oxymoron. It is not often that paper is thought of as a great weight, much like Romeo and his idea of feathers of lead. You don't need that, it's just a reference he's put in, but it doesn't get you any extra marks. This line shows how the speaker is making the conflict that defines her, both as a child and as a writer, tangible, just like writing the poem on paper would do. So this is another really sophisticated interpretation. So what he's suggesting here is that the poem itself is a paperweight because it's written on paper. Poem is just paper with marks on it, but it carries a weight because of the meaning of the words. So another brilliant interpretation. It could be improved further by making this interpretation somehow refer back to what we read earlier about the war photographer and the testing of his faith. But under exam pressure, Bo hasn't found an easy link. However, the speaker is conflicted about her portrayal of childhood. She describes how she opens, spills a grammar. This bizarre use of the article a again shows in her there should be discomfort in the English language, suggesting that she is unreliably narrating her childhood. This is a really interesting idea that Bo doesn't fully explore. What he's suggesting here is that when the narrator thinks back to her memory, the memory isn't necessarily correct. And all our memories are like that. He could have made a real contrast to the war photographer. The war photographer's memories are always going to be correct because they will be captured on film. And therefore there's a permanence to them. And every time you go back to the memory, it can't change. But Bo is suggesting that the narrator's memory here could be changing. And the evidence that he's put here is the idea of her having a grammar rather than the grammar. So A could be interchangeable. The grammar of memory could be different each time. A really interesting idea. Duffy's employment of caesura in the second stanza links to trauma theory, another really interesting interpretation. We got the ellipsis, rural England. This sudden declarative is sandwiched between two far more convoluted sentences, showing how the speaker has compartmentalized her experiences of war, his experience of war, which conforms to the trauma theory in which people who've experienced violence and chaos consciously ignore it. So he's suggesting here that the war photographer deliberately ignores the horror of what he's photographed, and this is reflected in the caesura, where we've got this tiny little sentence here which is sandwiched between the longer convoluted sentences. So it's a complicated interpretation, but he gets away with it because he's linked it to this theory of trauma. So he just about gets away with that. If you understand that, steal it, and if you don't worry, ignore it. Right. So, as it does not affect the present. This is shown again in the final stanza, where the internal rhyme of tears between the bath and lunchtime beers emphasises how readers of the Sunday supplement will, well, this is interesting, can you predict what this half rhyme of beers and tears shows us about the emotions of the readers of the Sunday supplement? Let's see what you come up with and see if Beau agrees. Give only momentary value to the photos that define the lives of millions. So the tears and beers, first they cry, then they have a beer and forget all about it. That links exactly to this momentary value. Much like the way the photographer stares impassively. So this links back to his theory of trauma. The war photographer deliberately hides his emotions away. The enjambment seen throughout the Emigree is demonstrative of the speaker's identity. So here the comparison isn't a really strong one, but he gets away with it because what he's saying is, I'm zooming in on the structural features. I've just talked about caesura and half rhyme. Now I'm talking about the structural feature here of enjambment. And under exam pressure, that's a valid comparison. So let's have a look and see what point he's actually making. The conflict that it contains. Her constant battle between childhood and its sunlight clear memories are inextricably and permanently intertwined with her present self and identity. The use of end-stop lines when describing her childhood would have signified a removal of past and present, which is not how Rumen presents the Emigree. So a bit of a complicated negative there, but what Beau is suggesting is that the use of the enjambment shows that nothing is final, everything runs on to everything else. So the past runs into the present, and he's putting forward the view that the childhood has created the adult here. They've been moulded by their past. Now we have a really good conclusion. To conclude, the experiences of a war zone that Rumen's speaker grew up in have a far more permanent effect than those of Duffy's war photographer. So now we've got a direct comparison again. Who ends the poem impassive to the war, seeing it as where he earns his living. So here, Beau is suggesting that the war photographer isn't properly shaped by the experiences that he's had because he's cut himself off from them, unlike Rumen's speaker, who is defined entirely by her experiences of childhood, and those define who she is as an adult. Now we get this really sophisticated idea of a Marxist perspective. This is the same thing here really as the socialist perspective. If you're studying an Inspector Calls, this will make sense to you. So having a point of view like this that comes from literary theory is a really good way to get a top mark, but only if you understand it. If you don't understand it, it'll make your answer gibberish. So, a Marxist interpretation, which remember is the same as a socialist one for the purpose of our essay, would argue that the photographer is representative of petty bourgeois capitalists. Well, we don't need the petty bourgeois. If you know what it means, use it. But it just means it's representative of capitalists who will grow numb to the horror of war, provided they earn some profit from it. So that's a very sophisticated point. The photographer gets paid. He gets a profit from war. In other words, he is exploiting the suffering of others for profit. That is a capitalist activity according to a Marxist viewpoint. Yeah, so if you just look at the economics of it, the photographer is taking money in return for other people's suffering, and that's what makes this a Marxist perspective that is attacking the capitalism of the war photographer and of course the capitalism of the society that uses these terrible images for entertainment in newspapers. This contrasts against Rumen's speaker, who places sentimental, not monetary value on her home, although it is personified as sick with tyrants. So now we've got the idea that she's still attached to this place sentimentally, even though it's been ruined by tyrants. So Beau's teacher has initially thought, yeah, I'm going to give that full marks, 30, and then reflected and said, no, actually, I'm going to give it 27 because I can spot some flaws in it. And the target he or she has given Beau is, I would like a range of context rather than you relying on Marxism. So this is really interesting because English teachers will disagree about the same piece of work. And that means your examiners will disagree, okay? So the examiner's advice actually is they don't want loads of context in your analysis of the poems. So you don't have to put that in. However, having interpretations in there is really useful. So what I would say is only use context that help you give an interpretation, which is exactly what Beau did here. The Marxist context gave him an interpretation, just as the Christian context gave him an interpretation. So I would disagree with this teacher's advice. That doesn't mean this teacher was wrong at all. It just means that that's what English teachers do, they disagree. However, let's go back to my mark scheme. So where did Beau not quite nail it? Well, he structured his comparison by moving from one paragraph on one poem to another paragraph about the other poem, but he didn't always link those successfully, so I'd knock off a mark there. However, he did show you how to write a lot about a little, how to delve into a quotation and really explore it. There weren't many quotations in that essay, but there were a lot of details explaining his interpretation of them. You also saw how he used more than one interpretation all the way through, looking at a Christian perspective, looking at a Marxist perspective, using words like perhaps to show that he was giving us more than one possible interpretation. When he's done that, he's always linked it to the poet's purpose. An easy way to do that is to count the number of times he's used the poet's name, but a more sophisticated way is to go back and think, well, when does he write about how the poet wants us to think? Because that's the poet's purpose. And again, the Christian interpretation and the Marxist interpretation will do that, as would the idea of trauma theory. Yeah, so there were three really detailed interpretations in there. So that gives you three ideas to steal: the trauma theory, the Christian interpretation and the Marxist interpretation. Three ideas you can absolutely steal, plus loads of vocabulary. And then finally, this idea of how to keep writing. So what you will have noticed is that I showed you 7 pages. I'll just show you them again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's number 6 now. I'm getting carried away. That's 5, sorry. 6 and 7. There they all are. And what you've seen there is a student who does not stop, who just keeps writing for the full time. Now, this is why your mocks are so useful to you, okay? Because you need to try that. Then you need to test it against the mark scheme. So some examiners would say, and they do in the examiner's report, If Bo had sat down and planned his essay, he could have made it shorter, but the structure would be better, and therefore he would get a higher mark. I'm not convinced by that. I actually think that he wrote so much which allowed him to give us so many different interpretations, which allowed him to show so much about the poet's purpose, and therefore he got higher marks than if he'd planned it. And what I notice is that typically students who get really high marks just tend to launch in answering the question with more than one point of view. That gets them the marks. They don't spend loads of time thinking and planning because you get no marks for that time. No marks at all for your planning. No one even looks at it. Okay, it doesn't get you any marks at all. Your planning is only useful if it helps you write a better answer. Now, my theory, that it's not just a theory, that's my experience, is that students who don't plan their answers to the poetry question and just write as much as they can, always answering the question, will get much higher marks because they're always trying to get to the next interpretation. But this is crucial for you. You need to try out these methods in the mock, because then you'll see if they don't work for you and whether the plan would have been better. If, however, you just plan in the mock, you won't know whether the plan helped you or got in the way. Yeah, so you need to do it the other way first, and then in your next go plan it and see if that helped. So big thanks to Bo. Hopefully you've stolen loads of ideas and techniques from him. If you would like me to mark your own work in the same way, just post it in the comment below or email it to me as photographs as Bo did. Good luck with your revision, and don't forget to subscribe.